Hi guys, it's Alex here, and today I'm going to present to you one of the most memorable games that a very young Bobby Fischer played. At the time he was 13 years old and he was facing international master Donald Byrne, who was then 26 years old, in the Rosenwald Memorial Tournament in New York City in 1956. This game was considered so beautiful by many that it was eventually nicknamed the game of the century. Now, we have to remember 13-year-old Bobby Fischer's opponent was a very strong international master who had in fact won the US Open Chess Championships only a few years prior to playing this game. The game started with the move knight to f3. Bobby Fischer, with the black pieces, responded with knight f6. White now played c4 and g6. After knight c3, Fischer played bishop g7. White played d4, and here Fischer castled, inviting White to play e4, after which we would have a King's Indian defense, a very aggressive opening where Black allows White to take hold of the center, but Black opts for speedy development and later an attack on the king's side. But Donald Byrne, perhaps already showing a lot of respect to the super talented Bobby Fischer, instead chose a more quiet move, bishop to f4. Since White has not played e4, now Fischer battles for the center directly with d5. This position is more like a Gruenfeld position, and White played queen b3 to put pressure on the pawn on d5. The pawn is being attacked by the knight, the pawn, and the queen, and so Black must respond to this. He captures on c4. The good news for White of this exchange is that Black has exchanged a d pawn for a c pawn. In chess, we usually value the central pawns more than pawns on the side of the board. So this is good for White. However, White must be careful because he has spent two moves bringing the queen out into a more central area, and we will see how this can be used against White if he is not careful. Now Fischer continued with the move pawn to c6, and White, happy that Black no longer has a pawn on d5, takes over the central squares on e4 and d5. And Black continues his development, knight b to d7. White played rook d1. So far, White's play is logical, but it's a little bit risky because look at Black's king on g8 and White's king is still on e1 in the center of the board. Knight went to b6, and the most prudent response would be queen to b3, staying in White's half of the board. But here, Donald Byrne played aggressively with the move queen to c5. At this point, Fischer continued his development with bishop g4, pinning the knight to the rook on d1. Here, White needed absolutely to continue his development with moves like bishop e2, followed by kingside castle. But lagging behind in development, Donald Byrne made what was to be a fatal mistake. He played the move bishop to g5. Now, this is really a very dangerous thing to do because you are so far behind in development, you already have one piece in your opponent's half of the board, and you bring a second piece into the opponent's half of the board, and you spend your time moving the pieces around too much. When this happens, you run a risk that the opponent will launch a fast attack and you will not be developed enough to deal with it. Fischer comes up with a brilliant way of exploiting White's inaccurate play. His next move here, Fischer wants to target the center. And he notices that the queen and the bishop, if only this knight on c3 was not defending the pawn, he could capture this pawn and attack the queen and the bishop. And so he comes up with a brilliant move. Knight to a4, targeting the knight and the queen and inviting white to capture this knight. If white does so, then knight takes e4 will be a double attack. And there is amazingly no good move for white here. For example, if bishop takes e7, we would have the moves knight takes c5, bishop takes queen, and then this knight on a4 would fall. If we do a material count, we can see that each side has the same amount of pieces, but the position for white is very bad because his king is in the center of the board, exposed along the e-file. His knight is pinned to the rook. His bishop is en prise. It's about to be captured if he doesn't move it. And his pawns on d4 and b2 are very, very, very weak. So, therefore, this is not a good option. If instead of bishop takes e7, white plays queen takes e7, then here, after the move queen a5 check, the white position crumbles. The knight is under fire, rook f2 a8 is coming, the knight on f3 is under fire, this bishop on g5 is also having problems. White's position collapses, there's nothing to be done. So therefore, in this position, after the move knight a4, Donald Byrne realized he cannot capture the knight on a4, and instead he played the queen back to a3. Fischer took on c3, and now, at first glance, one might think that after Donald Byrne's response, b takes c3, Fischer's play has only helped white to fortify the center, because if you capture the pawn on e4, then after bishop takes pawn on e7, there will be an attack on the rook and the queen. However, Fischer was unconcerned, and in this position, he did exactly that. He captured the pawn, and he offered white the possibility of taking a free exchange, a rook for a minor piece. Black continued with queen b6, and the idea that Fischer had is that while white is wasting so much time with queen moves and bishop moves, Fischer will sacrifice a little bit of material, but he will get a very strong attack. For example, if bishop takes f8 here, then after bishop takes f8, the queen is under fire. Queen b3, and now the very calm move. Not afraid of the queen exchange, black will play rook e8. At this moment, black has many threats against the white king, for example, knight c5 check, and even if white exchanges the queens, in this position, white is unable to deal with the multiple threats. Knight takes c3 is a threat, and knight g3 check, winning the rook, is a threat. As we can see, there would be an attack on the king, and the rook on h1 would be falling. White understood that he could not capture the rook, and so he played instead bishop to c4, developing his pieces. Now Fischer continues his sacrificial play. He plays another beautiful move. He takes on c3 with his knight. The pawn is defended by the queen, but the problem is that the queen is also defending this bishop, which is on the e-file. Notice the problems that white has because he ignored his development and he didn't castle. So here, if queen takes c3, then after a move like rook a to e8, the bishop cannot be defended. For example, queen a3, then simply queen c7, and the bishop will fall. However, after knight takes c3, it appears though it might seem as though Bobby Fischer forgot about one important detail. We just said that if queen takes knight, rook a to e8 will be a big problem for white. But here, Donald Byrne played the move bishop to c5. And here, Bobby Fischer is in trouble, or at least it would seem, because his rook on f8 is attacked, his queen on b6 is attacked, and his knight is still undefended. So if he plays queen to c7, white will simply capture the knight on c3 and be up a piece. Fischer gave a check with rook f to e8, and Donald Byrne simply sidestepped the check with king f1. Now, in this position, try and think, what would you do if you were in the 13-year-old Bobby Fischer's position here? You no longer have the rook under attack, but your queen is being attacked, and if you move the queen, you will lose a full piece. So what to do? If this game can be viewed as the game of the century, then Bobby Fischer's next move can be viewed as the move of the century. Here, Fischer didn't move his queen and didn't move his knight. He left both pieces en prise and instead made a brilliant retreat of his light-squared bishop. This move is extremely difficult to understand at first sight or to foresee, and it would have left Donald Byrne shell-shocked. Amazingly, white has no good response available. Donald Byrne in the game decided to capture the queen, which is understandable because if instead he had captured the knight, then this X-ray on the queen means that black would have queen takes c5, and after pawn takes, bishop would capture on c3. And this position would favor black since he has 6 pawns against 5 and the same amount of minor and heavy pieces. If, on the other hand, white captures on e6, then one of the key points is revealed. This diagonal from f1 to a6 is now no longer controlled by white's light-squared bishop. So black would not capture the bishop. Instead, he would play an intermezzo move, queen b5 check. If you are familiar with the smothered mate, you will see what is about to happen. If king goes to e1, queen e2 is checkmate. If king goes to g1, then knight e2 check, king f1, knight g3 check, king g1, and black will sacrifice his queen on f1, check, forcing the white rook to capture. And now that the king is surrounded by its own troops, knight e2, the knight delivers checkmate, it's smothered checkmate. So, this was one of Fischer's great ideas with the move bishop to e6. Therefore, if bishop takes e6, queen b5 leads to mate. If queen takes c3, queen takes c5 leads to a lost position. So Donald Byrne grabbed the bull by the horns and captured the queen on b6. Black took on c4 with check, and white now played king to g1. Knight e2 check, king to f1, and knight takes d4 check. A sort of windmill here has arisen. It's a particular type of tactic where the king is forced to repeatedly go into a discovered check. So king g1 and knight e2 check again, king f1, and this time around the knight goes to c3 with check from where the rook is attacked. White continues to have no choice but to go to g1, and now Bobby Fischer did not capture the rook. Instead, he took the bishop, creating a discovered attack on the white queen. White played queen to b4, figuring at least if I'm going to lose my rook, I will be able to win the bishop on c4. White, by the way, could not defend the rook because queen c1 would be a bad square for the queen. After knight e2 check, the queen would be also lost. So the queen went to b4, and now, like every great chess player, Bobby Fischer was greedy over the board and played rook a4, not giving white the bishop on c4. White took a pawn on b6 instead, and now black captured the rook on d1. If we now do a material count, we can see that each side has a knight, while white has one rook against two for black. White's queen is therefore facing a rook and two bishops. Rook and two bishops are worth more than the white queen, and on top of that, black is up a pawn and white's rook is completely out of the game. Black is winning, and the rest for a young Bobby Fischer was a matter of very simple technique. Let's see how the game ended. Pawn to h3. Fischer captured on a2, attacking f2, king h2, and Fischer took yet another pawn on f2. Rook e1. Fischer accepted the rook exchange. Queen d8 check intermezzo. Bishop f8 blocking, and now knight takes e1. Fischer plays the bishop to d5, centralizing the bishop and eyeing up the white king side. Knight f3 and knight e4. Queen b8 attacking the pawn on b7, and Fischer continues to prevent any unnecessary material losses. b5. Notice the beautiful coordination of the black pieces. Every piece in black's camp is defended. White continued with h4, black stopped any advances with h5, and white moved the knight forward. Black pushed his king forward to break the pin so that the bishop can now move to d6 on the next move. King went to g1 to take the sting away from bishop d6, so black gave a check on c5. King f1, knight g3 check, king e1, and checkmate at this point is inevitable. Bishop b4 check, king d1, bishop b3 check, king c1, knight e2 check, king b1, knight c3 check, king c1, and here rook c2 delivers checkmate. A really beautiful game by a 13-year-old Bobby Fischer, and one of the many early signs that Bobby Fischer would go on to become one of the greatest, if not the greatest, player of all time. I hope you enjoyed this game, and I will see you in another video.